Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression. It is something that had a huge impact on an entire generation living through it. A very differential sort of impact on different people and different parts of society, since some people suffered from it greatly and others not so much. And so we're going to look at some of these, look at the legal aspects, look at economic aspects, look at some cultural aspects as we go on, of something that really did transform the United States in a variety of ways. Well, the Great Depression is something we have now sort of vague images of, most of us, since we didn't live through it. But you can see here a bunch of people in line at an unemployment office for rent this entire building and so on. These were common scenes from the Great Depression. At certain points, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. And that unemployment often went on for years. So it's something that had a huge impact on people's lives. Roy is going to talk about some of the photography that comes from the 1930s, images such as this one, that portray the suffering of ordinary people as they went through the Depression. Now, here is a sort of picture of the stock market and how it developed throughout the 1920s, and then the incredible decline, bottoming out right around election time in 1932, then rising some, only to crash again in the late 30s. Now this is somewhat more dramatic than you might think because the bottom part is cut off. You're only seeing the parts that buried here. So it's a slightly misleading graph. Nevertheless, you can see how the gains of the 1920s were virtually wiped out in a relatively short period of time. That initial crash there, that was the October 1929 crash. Then things rebounded about halfway and then began this precipitous decline that lasted for several years. Now, the more dramatic thing is, in terms of most people's lives, was unemployment. This is unemployment as a percentage of the civilian labor force. As you can see in 1929, it was only about 3%. So that meant 97% of the people who wanted jobs had them. It rose dramatically. By 1931, it was up over 15%. By 1932, up near 25%. By 1933, over 25%. Then began a gradual decline, but as you can see, even at the bottom point in 1937, it was just around 15%, just barely below that. Then it went up in a sort of additional recession in the late 30s, up to almost 20%. And in 1940, on the eve of war, it was still almost 15%. So that's a remarkably high figure, something that is a little bit hard to compare to our current numbers simply because people calculate it differently. Now we count somebody as not relevant to the calculation if they haven't actually applied for a job in the last month. That wasn't the case for these numbers, so probably these numbers are the most comparable to what is now called U6, a number that gives the unemployment rate, not counting, not sort of tossing out from the pool discouraged workers and those who aren't actively applying for jobs. The current rate is right around 15%, just a little over it, if you take that U6 number, to give you some kind of comparison. So we're now in about the condition of 1937 or 1940. But as you can see, things got much worse than this during the Great Depression. This is an image of gross domestic product, how much the entire economy was producing. You can see the dramatic increase throughout the 1920s, and then the rapid decline that wiped out decades worth of gains, and then only a gradual recovery. It didn't actually fall so much in that late 30s recession, and then rose as we were on the eve of war. This black line in the middle is really just the overall trend line. So you can see that things were significantly over that in the 1920s and then dramatically under that for most of the 1930s. Well, here's another image. You can see free coffee and donuts for the unemployed and a long line of people there to get their free coffee and donuts. What were the causes of the Depression? Why did this happen? There are lots of explanations and lots of things that people point to as causes for the crash. It's all highly controversial, and so I'm going to be giving you different interpretations today. But the thing that most people point to is the stock market crash of October 1929. Now, one thing that sometimes people say is that the gains of the 1920s weren't real. That's not really true. There was a 45% increase in productivity, which means there was about a 45% increase in real standards of living throughout the 1920s. But on the other hand, by the late 1920s, there really was a certain amount of fiction going on. There was a large expansion in the money supply, 62% over that period, which is, notice, greater than 45%. There was an especially large increase in 1928. And as we'll see later, part of the reason for this is that a lot of foreign countries were buying American goods essentially because we were loaning them the money. Here's a way of selling your product, saying, if you say in effect, if you buy my product, I'll loan you the money to buy it with. And so lots of products were being sold. That was great for the economy in one sense, but it meant that a lot of loans were being made that couldn't be repaid. We'll talk more about that. There were low interest rates. There were other financial reasons. As I mentioned, there are lots of these foreign loans. Many of them turned bad. They were extended to countries to expand trade, and those countries really didn't have very sound economies and didn't have any way to pay them back. Another factor is that people began buying stocks on margin. The stock market had done so well throughout the 1920s that people started borrowing money in order to buy stocks. It's a very attractive idea when you've had almost a decade of stock market gains. People think, wow, well look, that stock is up 50% in 1 year. And so that's great, a 50% return on your money, but what if you were able to borrow it? Let's say putting down only 10%. Well then that 50% increase would turn into a 500% increase, and it would look like you were making a lot more money. And so people began to think, yes, I'll borrow the money to invest in the stock market. Well, as long as it continues to rise, that works out great, and you can get rich doing that. But if it falls, then you're really heavily exposed, and you can lose a lot very quickly. Also, by the end of the 1920s, there were a lot of speculative funds with few real assets. You're perhaps too young to remember this, but in the late 1990s, there was something similar with the dot-com boom. Anybody who had .com in their name could raise money in an initial public offering or could get venture capital, and a huge amount of money went into companies that were actually largely fictional, that didn't really have a product, that didn't really have any prospect for having a significant market. And something like that happened in the 1920s. There were investment companies that sprang up and took people's investment capital and didn't really have any real business to invest in. Yeah?
What was the favorite bubble of the day?
The favorite bubble of the day? To some extent, it was the stock market itself. It wasn't so much that these people, I mean, at least in the dot-com boom, there was, something, right? And earlier in the 17th century in Holland, tulips became the craze. Everybody was investing huge amounts in tulips. When my kids were young, it was Beanie Babies. People were paying hundreds of dollars for certain Beanie Babies. Now we have a closet full of these Beanie Babies. And they're essentially worthless. But at a certain point in the mid-1990s, wow, the little professor owl-like Beanie Baby, this was worth paying a lot of money for. I drove to Massachusetts to get one of those for my kids. Okay, so... Well, I was in New Hampshire at the time. It wasn't that far away. It wasn't Texas. But nevertheless, it was crazy, okay? Now, so anyway, here what it was is really these were funds that were set up to invest in other companies. And so it wasn't so much that there was a specific product like Beanie Babies or tulips or dot-com businesses or something. It was more, I set up a trust fund and I'm going to find companies to invest in. And those were the scams. It was like, these investment companies, that was the big bubble. And in a lot of cases, it really was just a bubble. There wasn't a lot behind it. Now, the crash, if you look at this graph I put up earlier, really wiped out only 1 year of gains. It was 1928 and early 1929's gains that were largely erased in that October 29th crash. And by the way, most financial crashes have happened in September or October. I'm not sure why. But there's a consistent pattern, and in fact, over history, you can do really well in the stock market if you simply invest in December and sell in March. Okay, why? The fall depresses people. It's like, the leaves are falling from the trees. The air is getting cold. It's cloudy and gray. Okay. Sell. I mean, I'm making it seem silly, but then later in spring, it's like, a new year, and the days are getting longer. Yay, buy! Okay, and there really is this sort of cyclic pattern. So there's that factor in addition. But in any case, that crash only wiped out 1 year of gains. The rest of really, you could say up to 1928, the gains of the 1920s were real. There was real productivity increase and real, you might say, financial assets behind this. But then the bubble came. Then the inflation of the bubble, it popped. Now, half of that was recovered in months. So you might say, well, the crash itself, why was that so crucial? In 1987, there was a crash that was in many ways comparable to this, but it didn't cause a Great Depression. And so it's unlikely that the crash by itself was the full explanation for the depression. You can see what happened. That's the initial crash, really just right there. And then things recovered, and then it was a sort of big decline after that. Now, what are other possible causes of the depression? Well, a lot of people have said, look, there really was a bubble. So in a sense, a recession was inevitable. People were extending too much credit. They were engaging in crazy investment schemes. There was too much money flooding into things with too little real hope of economic gain. And so something had to happen. Nevertheless, recessions go on all the time. Roughly every 7 years, there's a sort of recession, a slowdown in economic activity, where bubbles pop, where people start realizing, oh yes, a lot of the things we've done are kind of stupid, and there's a readjustment. What happened here, in 1930 in particular, to turn that into a depression? Really, if you look at 1929, that's the kind of thing that happens all the time in the economy. What happened in 1930 to make it so much worse? Now, really, there's no consensus about the answer to that. There were many policy decisions being made. Some were good, some were bad, and there's a lot of disagreement about which are which. And so what we're going to sort through are some of the major attitudes that people have about that. There are also very different effects in different countries. The United States suffered terribly in the Depression, so did a significant number of other countries, but some parts of the world actually came through this relatively unscathed. And so it's interesting to ask why certain countries suffered so much more than others during the Depression. Now, there are basically three interpretations that have a lot of currency today about currency, yes, that's an economic joke. That have a lot of currency today about the reasons for the Depression. There's the Keynesian approach. Well, in 1936, John Maynard Keynes came out with his theory of general employment, which was still a very powerful book in economics, and which explained this in terms of a market failure. Keynes says sometimes markets succeed, sometimes exchanges really do promote the benefit of both parties, but sometimes there are market failures where people's free economic choices do not lead to a good societal outcome. Sometimes they lead to disastrous outcomes. Now, why? He thought the Depression was due to insufficient demand. Basically, people were sitting on their money. The stock market crash made people realize, wait a minute, we've been foolish. We've been lending money much too freely. We've been investing money much too freely. We better save. He thought there was too much saving, too little spending. And so he thought the right answer is that government should spend to promote demand. In particular, Keynesians talk a lot about the multiplier effect. The idea is supposed to be that if the government spends $1, that doesn't just increase economic productivity by $1, it multiplies the effect, because the money the government spends then goes into private hands, and those private parties who receive it then turn around and use that money for other things, and so really the gain is much more than the amount of government spending, according to the Keynesian. So the Keynesian solution is that, at least under certain kinds of conditions, government should spend to promote demand. Now, not always. Sometimes the Keynesian will say, actually, there's too much demand, so government should rein in spending and so on. It's not always a recipe for increased government and increased spending, but in conditions like this sort of thing, where there's insufficient demand, the Keynesian says, yes, spend more. Private parties need to spend more, government needs to spend more to prime the pump. A second school, and by the way, Keynesian economics was really the dominant view of all of this, from the 1930s up through the 1960s. In the 1970s, the school that became much more popular was monetarism. The key figures in it were Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who wrote a monetary history of the United States that was very influential. And according to their analysis, the real cause of the Great Depression was a Federal Reserve failure. It was a monetary failure. The problem is really the money supply increased too much, especially in the middle to late 1920s, and then it contracted very rapidly in the early 1930s. So their analysis is that if you look at the amount of money in circulation in the United States, there was a 30% decline in the money supply in that short period between 1929 and 1932. During that time, also, the Fed let banks fail. There were banks that got into trouble. The Federal Reserve didn't bail them out, didn't do anything to back their loans or back their deposits, but didn't let them fail. That caused a run on banks. Have any of you seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Yep. Yeah, you see a bank run there. That was a common scene in the early 1930s, and That was basically the monetarist analysis. The Fed should have stepped in. There was such a contraction in the money supply. It's not really that they weren't spending from this point of view, it's that the money wasn't there at all. Banks weren't lending. The money supply itself contracted rapidly. And so from Friedman's point of view, really, the Fed should not have let the banks fail. It should not have contracted the money supply. It should not have raised interest rates. Instead, it should have lowered interest rates, tried to inject more money into the economy. There had been too much, in a sense, in the 1920s, but then way too little money available in the 1930s. The third interpretation is the neoclassical interpretation, and over the last couple of decades, that's been a more common explanation and a more popular explanation. According to this view, it's really a government failure. Okay, the private economy goes through these, sort of boom and bust cycles. What turned the bust into a depression in this case was really that the government responded in the wrong way. The government did a variety of things to keep wages high. But if there's a sudden recession, really the government should have allowed wages to fall. Instead, it kept wages high, but what that meant, if there's not very much money to go around, is that a lot of people were thrown out of work. Government spending, from this point of view, doesn't help. It channels spending from one source to another, from typically spending that would have been better, that private parties would have chosen, to less efficient uses. Now, why is that true? Well, the neoclassical view is the government can't create spending really in an economy, it can just shift it around. If the government spends money, where is the money it's spending coming from? Really, there are only three places it can come from. It can come from taxes, but then it's taking money away from one person and giving it to another. That doesn't really overall have any beneficial economic effect. I mean, there might be reasons for doing it, but it's not that you're going to increase economic activity as a result, typically. It might be borrowing the money, but then you're competing with businesses who would otherwise be borrowing the money to expand, and so that doesn't really help. The money the government is spending that's borrowed really otherwise might have been used to start businesses, build factories, and so on. The third thing is the government can simply be printing the money. And that brings us back to the monetarist explanation. That might be a good thing if there's too little money in circulation, and a bad thing if there's already too much. In any case, the argument is really government spending by itself doesn't do anything in any positive way. And in fact, insofar as the government takes money from people who would have spent it wisely and then spends it corruptly or unwisely, things get worse. Also, there's another factor, according to neoclassical economists, such as John Bates Clark or Hayek of the Austrian school. It really keeps the system from adjusting properly. What's supposed to happen when people make bad investments is that they realize, oh, that was dumb. Or they make a loan, they realize it's not going to be paid back, they write it down in the books. If the government takes action, it prevents them from doing this and prevents people from responding and adjusting in the way that's necessary. So from this point of view, it's really that the government blew it. The economy goes through these boom and bust cycles, but in response to a bust, you can do a variety of things, and if you do the wrong thing, you can make it a lot worse, according to the neoclassical people. Now, there are a number of videos that I want to recommend to you as places to go to find out a lot more about the Depression from different points of view. There is a wonderful show by Milton Friedman about the Depression that was broadcast on PBS in 1980. There's a talk by Amity Schlaze giving you a sort of neoclassical approach. There is this, from a human angle, just stories from the Great Depression, and then a PBS special on the crash of 1929 that gives you a kind of Keynesian approach. So if you want to see a sort of longer Keynesian or neoclassical or monetarist analysis of this, you can go to all of those. They're very interesting. Hoover's presidency. Most people, for decades, and really most people today even, blame the Depression on Herbert Hoover for reacting in the wrong sort of way. Keynesians think he didn't do enough. Austrians think he did too much. But in any case, there was, under Hoover, a great contraction in the money supply. From the cyclical peak in August of 1929 to a trough in March of 1933, which happens to be the month Roosevelt took office, the stock of money fell by over a third, say, Friedman reports. That is a dramatic reduction. You would expect, if the supply of money falls by a third, that then employment is going to fall by a third, wages will fall by a third, economic activity in general will fall by a third, and that's roughly what happened. So, from that point of view, there was an astounding Federal Reserve failure. And that decline, the decline in the money supply that you see here, then was tracked by a decline in wages, a decline in prices, and so on. It wasn't really until the end of the decade that all of a sudden you can see what's happening in the late 30s, a very dramatic increase then in the money supply. But there's another factor too. Hoover was himself a progressive. He was not at all of the sort of school of Harding and Coolidge. He was not somebody who believed in laissez-faire economics. He didn't want to just leave things alone. He was an engineer by trade, and was somebody who believed in intervention, believed it was possible to use government to solve problems. And so in this case, he thought that there was an important role to play for the government, but he did something rather odd. He thought psychologically it's very, very difficult for people to accept falling wages. If they are working for, well, let's put it in contemporary terms, if you're now working for a salary of $50,000, what if your employer says, I'm going to cut that to $30,000? That's psychologically hard for people to accept, even though that's what the money supply was in effect demanding. And so Hoover worked to keep wages and prices high. One of the things enacted during this period was the Davis-Bacon Act, 1931, which said that on all federal projects, people have to pay the prevailing union wage. And it was an attempt to say, look, we'll continue paying the wages we've been paying all throughout the 1920s, and in particular in the late 1920s. But when you combine high wages with then a decrease in the money supply, what's going to happen?
You're going to lose employment.
Exactly.
You can't employ people because you can't pay them.
That's right. You've got a contracted amount of money to pay people with, but you've got to pay them the same amount. You can pay fewer people then. And so it's actually surprising from this point of view that unemployment only rose to 25%. You'd expect it to go all the way up to 33% maybe, in line with the decrease in the money supply. Of course, wages didn't not fall at all. They fell a little bit. But Hoover was trying to prop up wages, thinking that was a good idea. It probably led to a great deal of the increase in unemployment. Yeah.
How could Hoover not, I mean, how could anyone not predict seeing that happen? Because that just seems like a really stupid thing to do in that situation.
Well,
like, why not lower the wages and try to keep more people employed?
Right. Part of it was that at the time, nobody had any idea what was happening with the money supply.
Okay.
And so, although it was falling dramatically, nobody at the time realized that was what was happening. And so if they had, they could have said, wait, why are we letting money contract so dramatically in the economy? We should be printing more money. We should be pumping money into the economy, not taking it out. But in effect, they did a variety of things to take money out of the economy.
Right.
And they didn't know what they were doing. So that's part of the reason.
So they just didn't have a lot of the access to information, I guess, that we take for granted too, right? Exactly.
They did not have access to good economic information. Additionally, the thought was that, well, maybe I can illustrate the point, actually, by talking about my two grandfathers and what happened to them during the Great Depression. One grandfather had been on a streetcar, actually, all dressed up, going to his high school graduation, when he met this guy who said, well, young fellow, you look like you're all dressed up. And he said, yes, sir, I'm going to my graduation. He said, really? How would you like a job? This was in the 1920s. So my grandfather said, sure. And he worked for the next 50 years for the B&O Railroad. In a job he hated, by the way, but nevertheless, he had a job throughout the Great Depression. His wages didn't fall, so actually during the 1930s he did very well. My other grandfather was a plumber who was self-employed, and during the 1930s, new construction basically stopped. People who had plumbing problems did whatever they could to solve the problems themselves. So there were years when, although he owned a car, he couldn't afford the fee to register the car. And therefore he couldn't drive it. He would walk 7 miles to the downtown employment office every day in order to apply for jobs, and then walk home 7 miles at the end of the day, having found nothing typically. Really, the family survived because he had a garden in the back and grew lots of cabbage and potatoes and onions and so on. My memory of his house when I was a child is really just this smell. Most people would say it's an awful smell, but I think it's a wonderful smell of fermenting cabbage in the basement, making sauerkraut. You would grow the cabbage, put it in these vats in the basement with lots of salt and the brine, it would sort of turn into sauerkraut.
Russians do that all the time.
Yeah, awesome. So I love that smell and love sauerkraut, but then again, most people wouldn't have that reaction. Anyway, that's how they got through the Great Depression. So if you had a job and you kept your job and wages stayed high, it was terrific, right? You thought, this is awesome. But if you didn't have a job, or if you had a job and then lost it, or if, like my one grandfather, you were self-employed, then you were in big, big trouble. Now, Hoover also raised taxes. Since economic activity declined dramatically, so did government revenues. Hoover decided to respond by raising taxes. By 1932, the top tax rate was raised from 25% to 63%. He instituted the corporate income tax for the first time of almost 14%. It's now 35%, by the way. He doubled the estate tax, i.e. the tax that people pay on what they're leaving to their heirs when they die. He also instituted a tax on every single check. So every significant transfer of money in the economy was now taxed. All of that further suppressed economic activity. It was just the wrong sort of thing to do, really, from any of the perspectives we've talked about. All of them would say, don't increase taxes in a recession. That's going to only make things worse. Yeah, question?
I was just going to ask, like, isn't that entirely non-Keynesian if he's
Yes.
It's contractionary.
Exactly. All of this violates what Keynes would advise, violates what the neoclassicals would advise. Doesn't really have a direct impact on the monetarist view, except insofar as it's taking money out of the private economy. Yeah. Okay, but many people point to another factor, the SmootHawley Tariff Act of 1930. There was tremendous pressure, since factories were not able to sell goods, to penalize other countries and to try to make people buy American, to penalize imports. And so Smoot and Hawley banded together to pass this Tariff Act of 1930 that Hoover then signed. 1,028 economists signed a letter warning them that the effects would be disastrous. Again, from no economic perspective was this a good idea. Thomas Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, said, I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto that asinine Smoot-Hawley tariff. That act intensified nationalism all over the world. And indeed, it had devastating effects and was not only one of the main causes of the Great Depression, but also one of the main causes of World War II. Now, why? Well, what it did is devastate European economies, in particular the German economy. And as we'll see, it led in that way to the rise of fascism. Here is the New York Times, first page, New York, Monday, May 4th, 1930. Over 1,000 economists asked Hoover to veto the pending tariff bill. Professors in 179 colleges and other leaders assail rise in rates as harmful to the country and sure to bring reprisals. Well, it did bring reprisals. Other countries also instituted tariffs. And what happened was a decline in international trade, but all of that was worse than it might otherwise be, simply because of the war debts left behind from the First World War, according to the Treaty of Versailles. The United States and the United Kingdom refused to forgive those debts that other countries had incurred, but they floated them large loans. They essentially said to other countries, look, I know you can't pay us back right now, what you owe us, we won't forgive the loans, but we'll loan you the money with which to pay our loan back. So they actually just increased the amount of the loans. Well, those countries were still unable to pay these ridiculously large debts, and shutting down trade shut down the only way they had of getting any money to use to repay the loans. The result was a series of government defaults. And so here is the spiraling effects on world trade as it goes down, down every month all the way through that period during which the stock market was declining, unemployment was soaring, and so on. Went from a total of 5.3 to 1.8 here, so shrank by much more than half. Went down to about, what would that be? About, well, maybe 33% of the original level. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. The decline in trade began with the stock market crash, but the Smoot-Hawley tariff led to decline as countries gradually responded and shut down trade altogether. Here's another way of looking at it graphically. From a height of about 3,000 to a decline of 992.
What a great legacy.
Now, sovereign defaults, Hungary, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, El Salvador, and Ecuador all defaulted on their loans in 1931. In 1932, Germany, crucially. That's also the year in which Hitler was elected. Bulgaria, Colombia, Panama, Nicaragua, Paraguay. In 1933, Romania, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Guatemala, and Uruguay. 1936, Poland, 40, Italy, Turkey. And so it really led to a series of government bankruptcies all around the world, and especially throughout Europe. The result, well, unemployment rose dramatically from under 4% to almost 25%. Here it is more graphically, in terms of long lines of unemployed. In the 1932 election, it was overwhelmingly a rejection of Hoover's policy. Hoover got only 40% of the vote. Roosevelt took 57% and won, well, as you can see, all but a handful of states in the northeast part of the country.
Manufacturing.
Sorry?
Manufacturing.
That's right. A few places where the manufacturers appreciated the attempt to actually ban foreign goods and so on. So, interestingly, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, lots of places I've lived. Oddly enough, went for Hoover. Anyway, Roosevelt said, our task now is not discovery or exploitation of natural resources or necessarily producing more goods. It is the sober or less dramatic business of administering resources and plants already in hand, of distributing wealth and products more equitably. Now, he says by the end, the day of enlightened administration has come. This is a very odd thing for him to be saying in 1932. Because notice what he's claiming here. He's saying, look, the problem facing us is not actually the problem that economic activity has declined. It's not that we're no longer producing enough goods. He's in effect saying, look, we've got enough stuff. It's a question of who has what. And so the main job should be taking it from one sort of person to another. Now, what he did was, well, as we'll see, in many ways continue Hoover's economic policies, in some ways do a series of new things, in a first and second New Deal. And I've been talking so much about the problems, I'm not going to get to his solutions very effectively, so I better hurry up. But the key thing, philosophically speaking, is that he says we need to recognize a series, really a new kind of right. The rights encoded in our founding documents are all what philosophers consider general or negative rights. That is to say, they're rights that other people not interfere with you. What is a right to life? It's a right not to be killed. What about a right to liberty? It's a right not to be imprisoned without due process of law. A right to property, a right to be able to possess your property, again, subject to due process of law. It's the sort of thing, in other words, that tells me other people can't mess with me. It's purely negative. It builds a boundary around me. But Roosevelt says we need to think about other rights, a new kind of right, an economic constitutional order that will give people positive rights. To what kind of things? Well, to the minimum requirements of life. So he says everybody has a right to life, and this means that he also has a right to make a comfortable living. He may, by sloth or crime, decline to exercise that right, but it may not be denied him. So he says, in effect, everybody has a right to employment. Everybody has a right to a job. Moreover, that's one of only a series of these. We might call these substantive positive rights entitlements. He says the duty of the state toward the citizen is the duty of the servant toward its master. One of these duties is that of caring for citizens who find themselves the victims of such adverse circumstances as make them unable to obtain even the necessities for mere existence. And indeed, in the 1930s, there were lots of people like that. Lots of people who had enormous trouble, through no fault of their own, in just coming up with the necessities of mere existence. And so Roosevelt is saying there's something fundamentally wrong with that. It is the duty of the state to help provide for people, to provide their basic needs. So what kinds of things would those include? Well, he says no one should go unfed, unclothed, or unsheltered. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that we have a duty to feed people, to clothe them, to shelter them, and that these are duties of justice, not just of charity. He's not simply recommending that people do this out of kindness to help others. He's saying, no, people are entitled to this. They have a right to this, and that right ought to be recognized by the government. The government has an obligation to provide these if people cannot, through no fault of their own, provide them for themselves. So, there are examples, well, here are some examples. People, he would claim, are entitled to housing, okay? They're entitled to health care. They're entitled to employment. They're entitled to food. They're entitled to other necessities of life. And I've phrased it in the way I have here to indicate these are positive rights in the sense that they're not just rights to non-interference. It's not just that other people must not do certain things. It's that people have to do them, right? If you cannot provide housing for yourself, other people have to provide it for you. If you can't provide health care for yourself, others have to provide it for you, and so on. So in this way, it is a duty for other people to actually help. That's why it's an entitlement and not simply a right that is really a liberty to be allowed to be able to do your own thing without interference. This says other people should interfere in a positive way to help you obtain these basic necessities of life. Now, what did he actually do in response? Well, by the end of the 30s, increased government spending significantly, though as you can see in the first couple of years of his administration that wasn't true, but by 1935 it began to increase very significantly, and by 1940 was up to almost twice the level it was when he took office. You can see that in a broader picture, where we looked all the way from 1920, and then in a picture that is broader yet, when we look all the way from 1900 to 1940. This, of course, was the First World War, so that was a dramatic increase in government, but then it went down in the early 20s, stayed more or less stable through the early to mid-30s, and then increased again very dramatically. Now, yes, question?
But a lot of people criticize Roosevelt for his New Deal and his government spending, saying he prolonged the Great Depression by 7 years.
Yes, that's precisely what the neoclassical economists argue. That all of this increase in spending was not only not beneficial, but was actually taking money from uses that could have been put by private individuals, by private businesses to create jobs, and moved it into other uses. And so, really, well, yeah, whether this is good or bad remains highly controversial. Some people say he's the guy who cured the Depression. Others say he's the guy who prolonged this into a decade-long experience instead of a year or two experience. And indeed, when you look at the policies, they're kind of a mixed bag. A lot of them that he proposed and enacted initially got declared unconstitutional very quickly. Let's look at the first New Deal quickly. It did involve a vast increase in the size and conception of government role. In the first 100 days, he declared a bank holiday in the Emergency Banking Act. He abandoned the gold standard, which did allow for dramatic increase in the money supply. He passed the Economy Act, which cut government employees' salaries and veterans' benefits by 40%. So unlike Hoover, he allowed wages to fall, at least within government. Also, this wasn't really his doing, but as it happened in early 1933, prohibition was finally repealed. And so that made people happier just because they could drink again. That was the major headline of the day, actually. Prohibition ends at last. I have a photograph in my office, actually, I think I've told you this, of the beer trucks outside the Texas State Capitol, waiting to serve the legislators their first legal beer in a decade. Now, other things, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. When you think about things that were damaging potentially, this is a prime example. The goal of this act was to keep food prices high. Why? By taking land out, or how? By taking land out of production, by plowing under crops, by slaughtering pigs. Millions of pigs were slaughtered and simply buried rather than used for food. Why? Well, the idea was that it was to keep prices high, keep farm incomes high. Yes?
Isn't it this act that sort of attacked in the Grapes of Wrath?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
This led to a lot of the problems, charted in the Grapes of Wrath and other things. It was declared unconstitutional in 1936. But it was widely unpopular. It led to widespread hunger. If you were a person in the cities who had nothing to eat, and then you find out that on the farms they're being paid not to grow crops, they're plowing their crops under, they're killing their pigs and just burying them, this was astounding. He created a variety of jobs and infrastructure programs, many of which were highly popular. The Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Rural Electrification Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. The person who really was instrumental in this was Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's how he built his power base in Texas. In any case, well, I won't go through the details of U.S. versus Butler, but basically it struck down the Agricultural Act. There was also the National Industrial Recovery Act. It established a national planning board, and it established a minimum wage, limited working hours, passed laws about working conditions, it negotiated with industry, it dropped industrial production 25%. It raised the costs on businesses by about 40%. It too was, well, there was a propaganda campaign in its favor, illustrated there, but it too was widely unpopular, and the Supreme Court struck it down in 1935, unanimously notice, in Schechter Poultry Company versus United States. Schechter Poultry Company was a New York City poultry company where you could come and pick out your own chicken. And that was against the NRA regulations that said you must not pick out your chicken, you must get it randomly. And the Supreme Court said that's ridiculous. Now, all of that was the first part. And as you can see, much of it was struck down as unconstitutional. But Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1936, was re-elected, and then instituted what many people called the Second New Deal. One of the key elements of it was the Social Security Act, which he is signing right there. Another element were tax increases. He raised the top tax rate to 79%. He helped pass the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, which tipped the balance between labor and management heavily in favor of unions. There were a series of extensive new regulations throughout the economy, and that all led to the recession of 1937 and 1938. So if the economy had seemed by the mid-30s to be rebounding, helping him to be reelected, all of this set things back significantly. And so, yeah. The last thing I'll mention here, we won't be able to go into details, is just that the Supreme Court, after striking down much of this legislation, reversed course. He threatened to pack the Supreme Court with 6 additional justices. There was a sudden change of mind of one Supreme Court justice. And so, in a variety of decisions, West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, U.S. versus Caroline Products, and later Wickard versus Filburn, actually during the Second World War, the court greatly expanded federal power. Essentially said that it could establish minimum wage laws, that it could ban certain products that it thought were unhealthy, that it could prohibit a farmer from growing wheat on his own farm, even for his own use. I will say as a little historical footnote that the product that was banned, allowed to be banned in U.S. versus Caroline Products, is still sold. It changed its name from Mill Nut to Mill Knot, but it still exists. What they did is move the factory so it was sitting on a state line, and therefore it was allowed to sell within 2 states, even though it couldn't ship products out of state. But now if you really want to, you can buy it online, and you can even get the original 1930 recipe book. What it is evaporated milk with some coconut oil in it. And it's rather funny to read that decision, which says this is a horrendous threat to public health. In any case, next time Roy will tell you about the impact of all of this on the culture, and in particular on the arts.